Riverdale is a show that makes you ask questions. Questions like, what? And why? And is this satire? And where the hell did this show come from? Unfortunately, I can't answer the first three. You're on your own with those. But I can answer the last one, and that's what I'm going to try to do today. In the few years since its pilot, Riverdale has gotten a lot of attention, to put it lightly. It's garnered quite a few video essays and quite a few more cringe compilations. I've seen a lot of these videos, and most of them basically boil down to one thesis: Riverdale bad. Regardless of how you personally feel about the show, it's a rich text with a complicated history. And personally, I think if you're going to ask for people's time and attention for a video you've made, it's worth the effort to try to say something new and interesting. Because I think we can all agree that Riverdale itself is, if nothing else, new and interesting. Now the story of a wealthy franchise that lost its relevance in the internet age, and the one man who had no choice but to keep it all together. Roberto Aguirre-Sacasa is the showrunner of Riverdale. He's been the chief creative officer of Archie Comics since 2014, and he also played a role in developing and writing the chilling adventures of Sabrina and Katie Keene, may they rest in peace. Before he started working for Archie Comics, Roberto wrote and produced plays for several years. In 2003, Roberto wrote a play titled Archie's Weird Fantasy, in which Archie Andrews, from Archie Comics fame, comes out as gay, attends college, and eventually moves to New York City, where he experiences the trials and tribulations of being a gay man from a small town living in a big city, or something like that. The day before the play premiered, Roberto got a cease-and-desist letter from Archie Comics threatening litigation if the play premiered as it was, stating that portraying Archie as gay would, quote, tarnish the character's image. Instead of pulling the play completely, Roberto renamed the characters and partially rewrote the script. Weird Comic Book Fantasy opened a few days later, with Archie, Betty, Veronica, and Jughead renamed Buddy, Rosie, Monica, and Tapeworm. Yeah, Jughead got renamed Tapeworm. I think about that a lot. If you haven't heard of Archie's Weird Fantasy before, here's a brief overview. Buddy Baxter graduates Rockville High, goes to college, and studies to be a writer. He dates his roommate named Nathan Leopold, who's secretly committing murders with another guy named Richard Loeb. Remember those names, Leopold and Loeb, they'll come up later. At least I think this is what the play's about. The information available online about Archie's Weird Fantasy is sparing, to say the least. And the stuff I was able to find mostly came from deep dives into theater news articles from the early 2000s thanks to the Wayback Machine. Anyways, the play is a coming-of-age story, a story about a young gay man struggling to find himself and navigate coming out, along with all the other parts of life in the quote-unquote real world outside of Rockville. After college, Buddy moves to Manhattan and lives with Tapeworm, Monica, and Rosie while working as a comic writer. He does eventually manage to find a nice boyfriend, and they live happily ever after, more or less. The play ran for a while and was eventually renamed Golden Age. A few articles were written about it, mostly praising its creative endeavors and applauding certain aspects, while also commenting on the strange pacing, confusing metaphors, and overly obscure references. To fans of Riverdale, that might sound familiar. In the years that followed, Roberto continued to publish plays while also writing for various comic and TV properties, including several Marvel comics and the TV shows Glee and Supergirl. In the early 2010s, Roberto began writing for Archie Comics, beginning with an Archie meets Glee comic crossover. In 2013, he created Afterlife with Archie, a comic series about a zombie apocalypse in Riverdale. Afterlife with Archie was so successful that in 2014, Roberto was named the Chief Creative Officer of the Archie Comics company. By the way, if you're wondering why Archie Comics cease and desisted Roberto Aguirre-Sacasa and then made him the Chief Creative Officer of the entire company 10 years later, so am I. So why does Archie's Weird Fantasy matter? After all, the target audience of Riverdale was like a year old when Archie's Weird Fantasy opened, and even if Riverdale viewers have heard of it, they probably haven't spent like 5 hours going through articles on the Wayback Machine to find all the specific little details about the play that are echoed in Riverdale. Well, here's what I think. Now that Roberto is the CCO of Archie Comics, he has the creative control within network constraints to do more with Riverdale than he could with Archie's Weird Fantasy. In fact, he's literally said that Riverdale wouldn't exist without Archie's Weird Fantasy. And not only is he in charge of an official Archie Comics show and therefore exempt from copyright claims, he's in charge of Riverdale.
A Bughead kiss, right now in the present, might be precisely what it takes to save a future Bughead from imploding.
To appeal to its audience and to feel relevant as a show set in and airing during the 2020s, Riverdale needs diversity. The kind of diversity that earned Archie's Weird Fantasy a cease and desist. Ever since Season 1, Episode 1, Riverdale has gone to great lengths to tell us that not only is it diverse and inclusive, it's also self-aware.
Is cheerleading still a thing?
Is being the gay best friend still a thing?
The writers still haven't realized that lampshading isn't the same thing as good writing. So, being the showrunner of an Archie Comics franchise starting in 2017 gives Roberto the creative freedom to at least start to explore some of the themes that he wanted to tackle back in 2003 with Archie's Weird Fantasy. Kevin has a few here and there plot lines relating to the struggles of being a gay guy coming out in a small town and trying to find a boyfriend, and the most recent season kind of deals with the idea of being an adult from a small town trying to make it in the big city, but the scope of Riverdale is honestly just much greater than the scope of Archie's Weird Fantasy, so it's hard to draw those kind of direct parallels. But we'll get to that later. Despite the fact that the show includes gay, lesbian, and bisexual characters, whether it's the long shadow of Archie's legacy as an all-American hero, aka heterosexual, or the CW's constraints, Roberto still couldn't make Archie gay. But that doesn't mean he didn't try. The original pilot script of Riverdale, that is, the original script written by Roberto before any network changes were made, is available online. Anyone can download it, and if you're a fan of Riverdale, I honestly recommend it. From here on out, for the sake of clarity, I'll refer to the original pilot script as just the script, and I'll call the final episode that actually aired, you know, the one you can see on Netflix now, just the episode. The script is a fun read, it's cool to see Roberto's original version of the show, and there are some really good bits that never made it into the final episode. Jughead's described as an emo teen heartthrob, and he's hard of hearing and uses American Sign Language at times to communicate with Archie. Hermione and Smithers smoke a joint, Archie gets to say fuck, all of which I wish had stuck around for the final cut. Overall, the script has a decidedly different tone than the final episode. It's much less censored in some ways. One of the most notable differences, at least for the purpose of this video, comes at the end of the script, when the audience is first introduced to Archie and Jughead's relationship. Up until then, Jughead has mostly been a detached observer who narrates the story without really getting involved. I talked in more detail about this scene in my other Riverdale video essay, so check that out if you want a more in-depth discussion of the subtext. For the scope of this video, here's what you need to know. Archie and Jughead used to be best friends, but something that happened over the summer changed that. Archie did something that made Jughead feel hurt, and they never really talked it through, so now things are uncomfortable between them. This conversation is ostensibly the first time they've spoken to one another in a few months. In the episode, this conversation between Archie and Jughead is barely a minute long. It's pretty unemotional. Jughead implies that talking through their problems could have saved their friendship, and that's basically as deep as the conversation gets.
Whatever happened, just talk to her, man. Go a long way. Would have gone a long way with me.
On the other hand, the script conversation starts out similarly but takes a completely different turn. There's this whole section where Archie actually apologizes. He doesn't say exactly what he's apologizing for, just says, quote, "Everything. I was a real dick." And Jughead's like, "Yeah, you were." And then Archie hits him with this line, "I don't want to die without us being friends again." Quoting directly from the script, Jughead considers this, and then Jughead says, "I don't even know you, Archie. You might as well be Jason Blossom to me." Still quoting from the script, Jughead takes a sip of coffee. That's all he's saying tonight, ... And then we get one of the only author notes in the entire pilot script. The conversation closes out, and then there's a parenthetical author note where Roberto inserts his own voice to say, "Yup, we'll be picking this story up in episode 2, ... This inclusion marks the scene as incredibly significant. In the entirety of the script, it's the only reference to the next episode, to continuing storylines. It makes it clear to readers that Roberto cares about this story, and that there's a lot more he plans to develop when it comes to Archie and Jughead. He wants readers to stay tuned, to know that there's more coming down the line. But like I said before, the episode has almost none of that emotional weight. Sure, we get the sense that there's some depth to their relationship, but Archie doesn't apologize, he doesn't talk about his relationship with Jughead being life or death, and there's no vulnerability. It doesn't feel like one of the most significant moments of the episode, as the parenthetical author note in the script would imply. In Roberto's original vision, this was a crucial storyline that would develop throughout the rest of the season, and the author's note encourages viewers to stay tuned because there's a lot more where that came from. In the episode that eventually aired, though, they're bros.
So why don't we both just do that bro thing where we nod like douches and mutually suppress our emotions?
Yeah, there's some backstory and some tension, but it pales in comparison to the importance of other plot lines, like the main mystery surrounding Jason Blossom and Archie's heterosexual love interests. And it sets up the way their relationship would be treated in the rest of the season, and honestly the rest of the series. Even though they've apparently been friends since childhood, their relationship takes a backseat to other plotlines. Archie's struggles with picking between football and music and finding the right girl to date take precedence over his relationship with his oldest and closest friend. Again, I talk a bit more about their relationship in my other video essay, so I won't analyze the diner scene too much here. But I think the main takeaway is Roberto wanted to go somewhere with Archie and Jughead. And by somewhere, I mean San Junipero. But at some point between the script and the final episode that aired, the CW decided that wasn't the story they wanted to tell. So we're left with some subtext here and there, plenty of scenes to critically analyze, and this script to dig through, but nothing actually canon. However, there's evidence that Roberto is hearkening back to Archie's weird fantasy, to deliberately reference this story that he was censored from telling then and he's been prevented from telling now. Archie is still the all-American hero, and maybe that's why some of the stories that are told about him have been, well, limited. Every once in a while, throughout Riverdale, Roberto has thrown in pretty clear references to the play. And whether they're actually shout-outs to Archie's Weird Fantasy or just Easter eggs for his own amusement, he's bringing the influence of Archie's Weird Fantasy into Riverdale. For some reason, Roberto wants us to keep the play in mind when we're watching Riverdale. Like it's this faint undercurrent running throughout the show where he's saying, "You wouldn't let me tell that story, but I haven't forgotten about it. I'm still the same person who wrote the gay Archie play. You can't censor me completely." Most people probably wouldn't notice these references, since you have to be pretty familiar with the details of the play in order to recognize them. But those who know about Archie's Weird Fantasy have picked up on it, and it's not just me. It's not just one or two elements either. There are some pretty striking similarities that make me think Roberto is intentionally trying to tell parts of the Archie's Weird Fantasy story, at least the parts he's been allowed to, maybe the parts that the network hasn't picked up on. In Archie's Weird Fantasy, Buddy's comic career contains references that indicate that the play is occurring at the same time as a series of famous trials in the 1950s where it was argued that reading comic books led to juvenile delinquency. So you'd think that the play was set at the time, in the 50s, but it also references modern phenomena like email. Riverdale embraces history in much the same way. While the majority of the show does appear to take place in the modern day, there are occasional anachronisms that prevent it from falling neatly into one time period. The creators and actors have also spoken in various interviews about the fact that Riverdale doesn't really have a specific time period. For example, Jughead uses a film camera to take crime scene photographs, when nowadays digital photography would not only be easier and cheaper, but also more reliable. If you screw up developing a crime scene photograph, that's evidence that's gone forever, when you could have just used a digital camera and ensured that the file would be saved forever. Also, the hospital nurses wear vintage, outdated uniforms, and other references throughout the rest of the show continue to remind us that Riverdale doesn't obey time the same way that most shows do. In Season 3, Archie gets sent to a juvenile detention center called Leopold and Loeb.
You'll be taken directly from the courthouse to the Leopold and Loeb Juvenile Detention Center.
Which, if you remember, are the last names of his college boyfriend and his boyfriend's partner in crime from Archie's Weird Fantasy. Speaking of the prison, Veronica visits Archie in Leopold and Loeb. To avoid being detected by her father, he's the one who got Archie sent to prison in the first place and doesn't want Veronica visiting Archie. Veronica goes in disguise. She puts on a blonde wig and shows up her the visit under her fake name.
Hello, Archie. My name is Monica Posh.
the same exact name that her character used in weird comic book fantasy to avoid litigation from Archie Comics. Now for the last and, in my opinion, most important reference. I think this scene is the most important tie-in between Archie's Weird Fantasy and Riverdale. It's not as obvious or on the nose as name-dropping Monica Posh or Leopold and Loeb, but it's the closest we get to seeing the version of Archie that Roberto originally wanted to write, back in 2003, pre-cease-and-desist. The scene happens in the middle of a drawn-out conflict between Jughead and Archie. They're growing apart and struggling to stay friends as their worlds bring them further and further into conflict with one another.
Kind of like when you and your best friend are two trains running on the same track in opposite directions. Destined to collide?
They haven't interacted much throughout this entire season so far, but Archie still comes back to help Jughead when he needs someone to go with him to deliver a mysterious package. It's kind of a long story, but they're in the car and this conversation ensues.
You know, I had this stupid idea. That after graduation, instead of going to college, we both moved to New York. You were this writer, and I'd be this musician, and we both live in like the East Village or something, just doing our thing.
There's a lot to unpack here. So Archie's vision of their future, the core four living their best lives together in New York City, is straight out of Archie's Weird Fantasy. In the play, the core four all live together while Archie's finding himself and searching for a career in New York. In Riverdale, in Archie's version of the future, he and Jughead live together apart from their girlfriends, who he seems to have conveniently forgotten about. Archie more or less literally tells Jughead, "I want to run away from our town and spend my life with you." He daydreams about leaving Riverdale and college and everything behind just so the two of them can be together. And for whatever reason, Jughead can't handle it, so he shuts it down by bringing up their girlfriends.
We're Betty and Veronica in this scenario.
They're roommates on Park Avenue.
There's no shortage of queer-coded or just outright homoerotic scenes between Archie and Jughead throughout the rest of the series. For more of a deep dive, like I said, check out my other video. I'll keep it short in this video. Suffice it to say, I think there's evidence that Roberto wanted to tell that story, and he's not just gonna let Archie go gently into that good night. For example, when Archie and Jughead visit Jughead's mom in the third season, this is her immediate reaction to seeing the two of them for the first time in years.
Oh, so you two finally got together, huh? I always knew there was something going on between you.
No, we're not together. We're just on the road together.
Yeah, like a romance.
Sure.
This scene has no plot relevance. It's never referenced again. It doesn't affect the plot in any way other than, for some reason, Roberto or the writers want us to keep in mind that there's this tension, this other dimension to their relationship that's clear enough that other characters notice it. Speaking of other plot-irrelevant one-off references to Archie and Jughead being more than friends, Cheryl has this iconic line,
"Out of the way, Bert and Ernie."
There are plenty of other scenes I could pick apart and analyze for the threads of romance and tension between Jughead and Archie, but I've discussed the most obvious ones. The others would require a lot of context and analysis, but there's a dedicated community of Riverdale fans out there who do take the time to put those pieces together. And I should know, I'm one of them. At the time of making this video, Riverdale is on a hiatus in the middle of its 5th season. It's honestly impossible to predict what's going to happen in this show. I have guesses, but Jughead just got abducted by aliens while on a shrooms trip, so I don't really know what to expect in general, especially when it comes to Archie's sexuality or his relationship with Jughead or any other Easter eggs from Archie's Weird Fantasy that we might see pop up in future episodes. I think all the tie-ins and hints are pretty interesting, and I think it's clear that Roberto wants to tell that story in whatever way he can, but frankly, I just don't know if I can expect that much from the CW. After all, this is the same network that aired the Supernatural finale. I don't even know what else to say about it.
Because the one thing I want, it's something I know I can't have. I love you.
But whether Riverdale ends with Jughead and Archie finally taking their road trip together, or with the fan favorite straight couples staying together, or with the core four deciding they're all better off as platonic friends, that's not really what matters. What matters is that there are fans who care enough about this show and about the characters to spend their free time researching and theorizing about how it could end. If Roberto can't tell that story, then, well, there are plenty of fans out there who tell it in as many ways as they can based on their own personal experience and infusing their own feelings and projections onto the characters. In my opinion, that's one of the best parts about watching a show as it airs. That kind of enthusiasm is one of the greatest compliments a show can receive. After all, Riverdale is a show that wants you to be immersed. It wants you to theorize along with the characters, and in doing so, you feel like you're a part of the show. Even if sometimes it feels like strapping yourself to the back of a pickup truck and telling them just drive. Whether or not Archie or any of the main characters ultimately get to explore their sexuality is beside the point. Because finally, there are fans who want to hear that story, and in its absence, whether due to network constraints or other plot-related reasons, we've created that story for ourselves. The characters' relationships have inspired countless people to talk, make art, and write about the characters' potential beyond what the show can give them. Dedicated fans will always have the things we've created, the bonds we've formed with other fans, and the stories we've been inspired to tell because of Archie, Jughead, and the rest of Riverdale. And no matter how the show ends, for us at least, those things will always be much more than a fantasy.